This is Ron Peters.
I'm John Nugent.
And I'm Sam Long.
Welcome to the After Class Podcast.
Because the best conversations happen
after class.
Thanks for joining us. Another episode of the After Class Podcast. We're glad to have you along. We begin with news, which we have none of.
Pretty much.
We were discussing that ahead of time. Not a whole lot going on because we're in the summer and we're just doing little things here and there. For example, John and I spent the weekend on a different roof, not my roof. We did my roof 2 weeks ago.
Yeah.
Right. This is a different roof in the church, and so we helped out a family and put a new roof on their house. That was not as easy as mine, far more slopey.
Yes, that's
really?
one of the steepest roofs I've ever worked on.
Yeah.
So as steep as the roof on my house, because my roof is almost straight up.
No, not
Yeah.
it's
Well,
not that bad.
I mean,
but
you
it's-
need roof jacks and boards to move anywhere.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah.
I mean, so
Right.
We weren't tethered in though, like at the Allison house, but
right.
nonetheless, yeah. But it was fine. It was hot, brutally hot. So we'd work in the mornings. Well, John mostly. I came late. I couldn't
was
get moving.
I was at 6 in the morning when
Oh,
the temperature is cool.
I was
and
late at
easy
night.
to work and yeah. And by the evening, so we usually wrapped up around 1:30 because then the shingles became too hot and sticky.
Right,
It was like upper 80s. Then you take a break for the afternoon and. Usually by the afternoon, I wasn't able to move, so I was not a part of the night crew. I was recovering to get ready for the next morning.
Right.
Yeah. I was on the roof until 10:30 a couple nights, so which was fine. I mean, whatever, better that than sweating and falling off the roof due to heat exhaustion. But unless we had it done, it was a good time ish.
And now the temperature's cooling down.
Yeah,
here.
of course.
Of course.
This
Right,
After
this
you're
would
done.
be the perfect weather for
Yeah,
the roof
that's fine.
today.
That's the way it
Oh my
goes.
goodness!
Yeah, we got some nice cool days ahead finally. And there's rain in the forecast. I'm so excited.
Yeah, it
We're
won't
going to get
happen.
rain in Michigan.
When is that coming?
Sunday, Monday, and Tuesday.
Okay,
So we
I
should
got
get a
time.
good
I got
soak
time to
of
mow
rain.
my lawn.
Yeah.
Yes. Yes, you do.
Same. And Ron's been going through a moving project.
Yeah, I'm moving into the office next door. It's a corner office, so I'm going to double my windows, but it's a little bit bigger, so I'm going to have more floor space. And one of the things I've been thinking about is how can we use it to record the podcast. I think we'll have more room for the table and all this equipment. So my room will feel less cluttered. I should say my room. Sounds like my bedroom at home. My office will feel a little less cluttered because we're going to have more floor space. And I have more bookcases, so I'm very happy about that.
And more room to set up the cameras for our YouTube videos. Yep.
What I've been arguing for 5
not
years
happening.
that nobody else wants to agree to.
So that's where we're on. We're into our summer swing, and so we'll keep you updated with what's going on in our lives. I'm sure you're very fascinated.
I'm
by
sure the
it all.
curiosity there is just,
Yeah, you'll be hearing a lot more about The Office when we actually are recording in it for the first time.
Sure.
Right.
I'm sure we'll make a big to-do about it.
Yeah.
Yeah, big grand opening.
Yes.
The brand new after class studios.
And it may throw some things off because, we're used to the space, seeing certain
true.
things, looking at certain things, and, like, you're going to have a window to look out if you're facing the same direction, Sam. Right now, like, Ron's looking out the window, and I'm looking at bookcases.
Right.
Yeah.
We'll see where the chairs land.
I mean, I just want to be able to see the fox. As long as I can see the fox, I'll be fine.
yeah.
I think actually we'll be able to have the chair set up exactly the way it is in here. And, we moved around a little bit early on. We tried a couple of different rooms. And then I just said, why am I setting up and tearing down all the time? Let's just do it in my office. So we have been in here for almost 5 years doing the podcast. Took a little while for us to settle.
To be clear, we take breaks and leave the office. Just saying.
Yeah.
We do that. Exactly.
I will. This summer, I'll be spreading into another office. So the other corner office, which going into next year, I'm going to have a special assistant to the vice president of academics, Heather Bunce, and she's going to be coming on part-time to just help support the workload of the academic department. And so she's going to move into the office next to me, but she wants me to move some of my books in there onto the bookshelf, so there's more books on the shelves, which I'm more than happy to do because I am packed out.
Right.
Yeah.
I need to create space.
Yeah.
Because I just keep spreading on top of all the surfaces in the office. So I'm looking forward to that. And we're going to have some comfortable seating in there so that when I have people to interview and talk to, my office is I don't think it's the most hospitable office. It's very functional. And so Heather's going to make it a place that I can use kind of for meetings. And so I'll be kind of spreading out a little bit into a couple of offices, but I'll still be functioning in my normal cell. Which still has a nice window in it. So.
Sure. It does. Well, I'm very grateful for the fact that every office has a window. You
Yeah.
know, that is one of the real benefits of our office wing down here. So I like that.
Right.
Well, we're going to do something different
What
today.
are we doing today, guys?
Yep. Well, we do whenever we need a little break in the action.
Yeah, a long time ago we said we're going to try to, in between major series, do a movie review. And we haven't done one in a while. And I feel like we've wrapped up a few major series without having a movie.
Yeah.
So it's summer, fresh ideas, and so we're going to do a movie review.
Yes.
Ron, you want to introduce the movie?
Yeah, so we decided to do the review the movie Jesus Revolution. It's this year. It came out earlier this year, so it's a 2023.
Which I think is the first modern movie we reviewed, right?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Most of them
I think
are
so.
usually 5 to 20 years old.
Yeah.
Okay.
So we're finally a little bit up to date.
Hey, we're hip with the
Hip.
cool cats.
We're not a bunch of squares, as
That's
they say
right.
in the movie. So.
right.
Yeah.
The movie, and I think probably most people know about it, but just to give you a little bit of an overview, the movie is set in 1968, 69, in that time period, the late 60s. Of the 3 people in this room, I was the only person alive at that time.
Yep.
That's
I
the
was
truth.
still in diapers, but I was alive when the events of this movie were taking place. It's set in California, and the basic premise of the movie has to do with the rise and incorporation of Christian hippies into the traditional church. Kelsey Grammer plays Chuck Smith, who was the pastor of a very traditional church. Man, I can't remember the other actors' names though, so I should pull them up. The guy who plays
Jesus from The Chosen. I
yeah,
don't
the
know
guy
his
who
name.
plays Jesus in The Chosen is Lonnie Frisbee, who is this hippie Christian who comes to his church, and the two of them form a kind of bond and begin reaching out to the hippies. So you've got the guy who plays Jesus, who in the movie says that he's called that Jesus-looking guy.
Yeah.
So it's a little bit of an in-joke
Yeah.
there.
Yeah.
I thought that was pretty funny.
And so I thought about this whole movie. Is his last name actually Frisbee?
Yeah.
That's crazy.
Well, I assume it is. I guess
Yeah.
I'd have to dig into it a little bit more, but I'm pretty sure it's Lonnie Frisbee. So
I don't know. Every time they said it, I'm like, it makes perfect sense because, hippies and Frisbees and
he was kind of
Hagen
a flighty
Sacks and
guy,
all the rest.
so
Yeah.
it does fit. And then the last character, who is in many ways I think is the central character of the movie, is Greg Laurie, who was a teenager coming from a broken home. His dad's been gone for a long time. He's been bumming around with his mom, who's not all that reliable. Starts out in the movie going to a military academy, but gets kind of drawn in by the hippies and goes on his own sort of journey of discovery. Hooks up with a girl who is also a hippie. Her name's Kathy. And the two of them fall in with Lonnie and the movement of Calvary Chapel, become Christians, and it's really their story. It's the story of Chuck, Lonnie, and Greg primarily, but Greg and Kathy is a blossoming couple, and coming to Jesus, the enthusiasm that goes with that, but it kind of takes a dark turn in the last 30 minutes of the movie, where a lot of things begin to fall apart.
Sauron shows up.
Yep, the Ring of Power emerges, and we have the council. No,
Yeah, what I like is there's these two separate stories, and then they converge about halfway through the movie, and
Yes.
then finish out together, right? Because you have the two preachers type figures, and then you
Right.
got the wandering guy who doesn't know what's going on, but eventually they come together. So
Yeah, they all
I found that kind of
converge.
fascinating. These parallel storylines that eventually merge.
Yep. But it's a happy ending movie for Greg and for Kathy, even though they go through a period where, they break up and Greg goes through a little bit of a dark period. He comes around, and the two find each other again and live happily ever after. And at the end of the movie, you get a little bit of update that, you get some information, the credits of what happened to Chuck, what happened to Lonnie, and what happened to Greg and Kathy. So.
Yeah, because to be clear, you didn't mention the beginning, but if you didn't know, it was based on a true story. Like, these are actual people in the world and things that happened in the late 60s and 70s and moving forward.
Yeah, if you've ever heard of Calvary Chapel, it was a literal church that still exists to this day. Pastor Chuck was a pastor till I think he died, which wasn't that long ago, back in 2013.
Yeah.
Yep. Lonnie died pretty young. He died in 1993. His story is a really mixed bag. I don't question that he was a man of God, but I don't think he was a perfect person by any stretch. And then Greg and Kathy are still together and have had a ministry there in California, a different church. I think it's Harvest Church is what it was called.
Yep.
So a very successful. Well, I say successful. We could talk about how we define success. What makes for a successful church. But I think that they deserve the term a successful ministry that they've been in for years. So I think it was a It was a good movie. It was a feel-good movie. If you're watching it as a Christian with a sympathetic attitude, I think it was a good movie. And we're going to talk about the things we like about it and give our own assessment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Anything else you want to say about the plot of the movie?
I think you covered it pretty well. I mean, if you've seen it, you know what's going on. If you haven't
Right.
seen it, you should just watch it. You don't need to.
And I think certain plot points will come up as we're talking about it too.
Probably.
So more specific things.
Yeah, I mean, to me, one of the things that really stood out, and it really helps. I mean, I had all this happen before I was born, right? So, and I have like in-laws and friends who are like a part of the Jesus movement, deeply impacted by the Jesus movement. And so it helped me kind of see what it was. And I guess it helped paint the picture. And it's kind of like these two different plot lines that you talked about that come together. You have the hippie movement growing as kind of political protest, as social protest, as experimentation time with drugs and LSD, right? And you just have a young generation that is having their own social revolution, right? I mean, and it's a bona fide revolution in its own right, and impacted wider American society. And here you have off of this, it's like, what is the church going to do about this, right?
Yeah.
How is you have this revolution, and people they're on drugs. Yeah, certainly not all of them, but they're starting to wrestle with big questions about reality and truth, and Vietnam War is going on, and what should we be doing? Where should we be? How should we involve? What does love have to do with all this? Yeah. And so you have this whole generation asking really good, big, important questions, and then the question for the church is, what is the church going to do about it? Mm-hmm. Yeah. And this movie kind of told the story of how at least Chuck Smith's church what they originally thought of it is, these are bad people. Right. They're messed up in the wrong stuff. They need to get their life together.
Take a bath, hippie.
They need to stay out of my home and stay off of drugs. It's kind of
our carpet.
Yeah.
But then, this church kind of lets them in.
Yeah.
Right. And then out of it comes a revolution within the church.
Yeah.
And,
exactly.
And those people who that passion and energy that was like channeled toward protest and alternative lifestyles got channeled toward Jesus.
Right.
And so I don't know, it's the movie to me is a great example of contextual ministry, because what came out of it was a bona fide church, like real life expression of the gospel in the 20th century. Yep. Interacting and responding to the questions that people are asking their day.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think that there was a real seismic shift at that time period about how people understood what it means to be the church, what it means to do church and be a community of people. Up to that point, you had a very traditional model of church, and everybody more or less did the same thing. Going to church on Sunday, dressing up, treating it with a high degree, we might call it like dignity and respect. And they viewed the hippies as violating all those normal conventions. The one guy is upset that they're coming in barefoot and ruining the shag carpet. It's like, but these were things that people really cared about because that's how they understood being a part of a church. And it's not that you didn't hear the gospel message and good Bible teaching. That was happening, but it was happening in a context that in many ways robbed it of its power. You're hearing the message, but you're not really hearing the power of that message. And that's I think the challenge that's thrown down for Chuck is that, his daughter brings this hippie in their house. He makes a comment, if God brings a hippie into my house, I'll listen to him. And the next thing you know, his daughter's bringing in this hippie guy, who is Lonnie Frisbee, who was a Christian. He's a Christian at that time. And the two start having a conversation. And Lonnie challenges him. Here's a guy who clearly loves God and knows the Bible. And Chuck's like, he's just so convicted by it that he decides he's going to open up his church. And that was such a radical shift for people. And there were some people in church who accepted it and those who didn't. And some people walked out on him and never came back. But I think that if you go back to that time period, the late 60s and early 70s, as people began to see that these are young people who love Jesus, they're broken and they're suffering, and Jesus is bringing a message of hope and healing to their lives, that more and more churches began to say, there's something real here. And some churches didn't. Like, there are a lot of churches that said, no way, we're not going to be a part of it. But other churches began to do the same things Chuck did and say, you know what, God is moving in this, and we want to be a part of what God is doing in this church by his Spirit.
Yeah, and they're not just welcoming people who love Jesus. They're welcoming people who are exploring truth.
Yeah.
And at least want to give Jesus a try.
Yeah,
So
asking really good questions.
So you have this evangelist, Lonnie Frisbee, who's he's going out there where the people are, and with a bunch of people and like exposing people to Jesus. Have you considered Jesus as the truth that you're seeking?
Yeah.
And he's bringing these truth seekers to this church building,
Right.
and so I guess there's half the people that are being brought in they're not Christians, and they just want to hear this gospel message because they're meeting some really cool people who are Christians, who share their hippie vibe and their truth quest, but yet they have something more. They have a name, a savior to it, and not just protest.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know if that's just, there was the one scene where where Greg first started to like hear the message, but they were on like a campus, and like the Satanist stood up and said like "Hail Satan," and then he came up behind like, "Okay, cool, bro." And it's like I just found that like fascinating where this, he went to where people are and was not like confrontational, just said like, "Here's my message," and it's very different than what I see today, where everything is a protest and there's no actual conversation happening, and everyone's shouting each other down.
Right.
Yeah, that's one of the most interesting things about the character of Lonnie Freed in the movie. It's Lonnie, right?
Lonnie Frisbee.
Frisbee, that's right.
Yeah.
I know a Lonnie Freed who's in one of the local churches. It's the way he interacted with views that were not his own. Like he was around people all the time who he just disagreed with.
Right.
And and I thought the example of the Satanist is like right on. And he's like, instead of following it, and condemning it, this guy is totally wrong, you got to not listen to him. Instead of like bringing down the guy he disagreed with, he's like, wow, that was intense. Right. And then says, and now let me share you some things that I've seen, and then starts talking about Jesus.
Yeah.
And and that's the way he was throughout the movie. Like whoever he encountered, even if it's like a preacher, like when he came to this guy's house, this guy's obviously lives on the road. He was in San Francisco for a long time, kind of living on the streets, and he's brought into this prim and proper house, and he's like, this place has great vibes. He's not like condemning the materialism of the pastor.
Right.
Down with the
right. It's kind of like I don't know. He kind of modeled, I guess, a kind of tolerance that's admirable.
Yeah.
Like just how to like occupy other people's spaces and let them be them and appreciate what's good about that space, and still you have your own convictions and your own way of life that maybe and is radically different.
Yep.
But it's not like constantly trying to dethrone other people's spaces.
Right.
Right.
Yeah, there was a moment when he's like walking off camera with Chuck's daughter, and she's like, we're having French toast, and he's like, oh, I love French toast. Like, it's just those kind of little comments. It's like he's always just so, yeah, that's great, I love that. And again, it's a very hippie-ish vibe, but just I think your assessment is spot on. That never trying to tear people down, but just like, I'm going to bring you a message, and I want you to think about it. At a time when people were really searching, and that's one of the big themes of the movie is that, for a lot of hippies, they're searching for God, and that's one of the things Lonnie says. Like they're looking for God, and Chuck asked him, he's like, well, what do you think about your people, meaning the hippies? And he says they're like sheep without a shepherd. They're searching. They're searching through drugs and experiences and things like that. They're looking for God, and they're not finding Him. And I want to be the person that brings God to them. So it was really cool.
And it says great language to use, and it's hard to know what how much of these lines have been written for him, right? And how much of these reflect what he actually said. But he sees these people, and it's kind of like how the prophets of Israel saw Israel. I mean, they need a good shepherd. They've been, this is Ezekiel. Like they've been led by false shepherds.
Yeah,
and they're doing idolatrous things. Like there's obviously wrong things about their lifestyle, about their values, about their use of time, money, energy, resources, and social injustices. And I can say like what they need is a true shepherd. And then when Jesus comes on this scene, it's how he sees things.
Yeah. Right.
Walking in the tradition of the prophets. And, when someone like Lonnie Frisbee comes along and observes the hippies, it's how he sees things.
Yeah.
Right. And so, which, of course, we're going to get to the question of relevance to today.
Right.
But we're going to ask the question: what are the hippies of our day?
Mhm.
right?
Yeah, exactly.
And stuff of that nature. So.
Right. We're going to talk about our own connection. Was that our next point? So, for me, there's an organic connection because I spent like 18 years in a charismatic church and part of the charismatic movement. The pastor of the church, he had a real nostalgia for Calvary Chapel. He would talk about people like Chuck Smith, or like in the movie, you have Catherine Kuhlman who's interviewing Lonnie. And I remember this pastor talking about Catherine Kuhlman all the time. So these are like names that I'm very familiar with. And a lot of the stuff that emerged out of it was really familiar to me. There's a point in the movie where they're having one of their tent meetings. Lonnie's up front talking, and all of a sudden he just like pauses, and he starts like, okay, there's somebody here who's suffering. And those kinds of meetings, I've been to hundreds of them. I know what that looks like and feels like. And so for me, I was really connected to the movie because that was part of my tradition, even though I don't call myself a charismatic anymore. I always tell people, I'm not a cessationist, and I'm not a charismatic. I'm kind of like a man without a country in that regard. It was just very, very familiar to me. And it was familiar in a good way because you did see God working through Lonnie. At the same time, you saw the challenges of it, which we're going to get to in a little bit. I'm not going to get into that. But like I said, I felt very comfortable because I'm like, yep, yeah, I know this world. I've lived in that world. And there was a nostalgia that I enjoyed and a part of me that went, yep, I know how people fall into that trap too.
I'm very far removed from that, just by my background and my age. And so I don't have like direct sort of interaction with it, but I have more indirect. And we were talking about this in my house after the movie that I was a child of the grunge era in the 90s, but there were a ton of bands and groups, and even just the whole contemporary Christian music scene, I think could be directly attributable to this movement, right? Where they're just doing things differently, right? They're throwing hymnals out, they're throwing the organ and piano out, they're like, bands and guitars and rock and just like singing songs about God that are relatable. And so like that was, I think, the start of something that, now it's just a crazy business. But but in the in the 80s and then in the 90s, like that's the music I was listening to when I was listening to Christian music. And so, and even we even talked about how just the nature of like even like a campfire sit around sing, I think could be probably traced back to that idea of it's very informal and you were sitting around praising Jesus, and like that was my life, going to camps, and like that's what worship was. And so again, I'm sure there are probably music experts say, well, no, it started before that. Like, okay, but the movement of all the things incorporated in it, but music and worship being one of them, that like I like impacted how I grew up and the songs I listened to. Like I think of like even like a Tony and Donnie at CIYs were like, they weren't hippies exactly, but they definitely were like, that's what they were doing, but with a little more modern flair to it, I would say.
Oh, yeah.
And that's who I listened to growing up. That's who's at the conferences. So that would be the biggest impact for me from this like scene, as opposed to like the actual rest of stuff you're talking about.
Yeah, and Tony and Donnie were connected. I don't know at what point they were connected to the Vineyard movement, which grew out of the Jesus People movement. And which kind of gets to some of my connection. Like Sam, I wasn't born at the heyday of this, and I didn't grow up in a family that was deeply involved in it. And so it's not like my parents were involved in the Jesus movement either. I grew up in churches that were still in kind of conservative mode. But at the same time, I think there's something from this movie that has always been a part of the churches that I've been a part of that maybe wasn't before this, and that is just that notion of come as you are. All people are welcome here, and an effort to rethink music and do things. Like it was slow and progressive, but I think maybe the Jesus movement opened up this openness to new ideas and this come as you are feel to the church. Even though the churches we had, they were mostly functional. They weren't, ornate, high church, architectural churches. They were kind of, there's no church I would have grown up that would have said, you don't belong here because, you're dressed a certain way, or you look like you haven't showered, or I think when I was growing up, like the Jesus movement had kind of broken the traditional church of that mindset.
Yes.
Obviously not all churches
Right.
in all times and places, but at least the ones I grew up in were always kind of come as you are.
Yep.
And I think I could take that for granted growing up. That's just the way Christians are.
Yeah.
But like a decade before then, it wasn't that way.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
And this Jesus movement is a big part of helping the church in America, at least, make that shift.
Sure.
Yeah.
So I was deeply impacted by that. Also, Christian music played a big part in my faith conversion. Like, music was a very big part of my life before I took my faith seriously. And so the fact that when I started taking my faith seriously, there was Christian music to help me articulate, my newfound convictions and to inspire and encourage me in those newfound convictions, right? That's again, I could take for granted. The heavy lifting to make that switch toward rock being acceptable and played by Christians. There's still, that debate was still going on. Like,
Right.
is heavy metal Christian music an oxymoron? Like, can you do it? Is it legitimate? Or is there something about the sound itself that is from the pits of hell?
Right.
That can't be. Of course, those kinds of debates are long gone. But again, I think I owe a lot of my formation to the changes that the Jesus movement made within the American church as a whole. And I'd say more directly, my in-laws, Mike and Shirley Wetzel, who were Great Lakes students back in the day, and around the time of the Jesus movement, they were part of the Jesus movement. And there were people at Great Lakes who, when we were located in downtown Lansing, who would walk the streets of downtown Lansing and talk to drunk people and drug dealers. And my father-in-law was in the midst of that, and having the hippie vibe and living together in this house, this broken down house that they kind of made a Jesus lighthouse,
Right, yeah.
So I've got, relatives, very close relatives who were right in the midst of it when it was going on. And some close friends,
Yeah.
like Steve Bush was impacted by the Jews for Jesus movement that kind of spun off of the Jesus movement. And they settled. There was a movement in Detroit, and so not too far from here, that grew out of the Jesus movement. And I guess maybe another thing that's personal to me, it's out of the Jesus movement that churches in America started experimenting with new forms of church, meeting in homes,
Yeah.
right? And doing church kind of communally, and the idea of sharing resources and working on each other's roofs, right? Having our lives intertwined, that the work of the one household is the work of the wider body, and meeting in homes and, more organic lifestyle church gatherings. And so for me to be a part of a network of house churches, I guess that way was also paved by the Jesus movement, and kind of opened up thoughts. Of course, house churches go way back.
Right.
And this is maybe transitions to something that we all kind of share as a connection to the Jesus movement, is in this revival, and really historically, whenever there is a big revival, a work of the Holy Spirit, a rethinking old wine and new wineskins kind of thing, or new wine and old wineskins, there's always this restorationism that is part of the theology. There's, everyone kind of says, we've gotten too cluttered with all the stuff of our day. We need to go back to the way Jesus did it, and the early church, and what they were doing in Acts, and meeting in homes, and breaking bread together, and selling our property, and taking care of each other. That restoration impulse that was a part of the Jesus movement was a part of the founding of the Christian Church, Church of Christ.
Yeah, exactly.
Which is the non-denomination behind Great Lakes Christian College.
Yep.
And so in our own roots, we have this revival context, and you have some charismatic stuff, people falling, slain in the spirit, barking, laughing, fits, healings, that kind of stuff going on during the revivals. The Great Awakening was the context in which the Christian Church, Church of Christ, was born, and we still have that restorationist mentality among our churches.
Yeah. Go ahead.
I was just say, at the end, they talk about this is the biggest revival that historians think ever. And bigger than Cane Ridge? No. Probably. But I mean, you're right, this idea of, when God's doing something new, it forces you to say, well, what have we been holding on to for so long for no good reason? What can we, jettison and keep? And so, all these sorts of movements and ideas, they challenge us to remember what's the most important thing we've lost sight of, perhaps.
Yeah, and I think that it's funny as I watched the movie the first time. This is the second time I watched it. My wife and I watched it just a couple days ago, so I've had a couple viewings now. as I was watching the first time, I was just thinking about, my own connection with it. I think a lot of people would look at me and go, "Oh yeah, Ron totally connects with Lonnie Frisbee because I have long hair, I have a beard." And people are like, "Oh, look at that hippie guy." That's not me. I am not a hippie guy. Apart from the long hair, I have absolutely nothing in common with them whatsoever. As I was watching the movie,
no commitment to love and peace.
Nope, no commitment to whatsoever. Bring on the war. Let's just kill the world and blow it up.
I think you overemphasize the difference between you and them.
Where we connect on Christian
You're not
values,
an open thinker, asking big questions.
Where we connect on Christian values, yes. But I take a bath. I don't do drugs. I've never got high in my life. All of the things that most people associate that are strictly hippie things or not things.
The negative stereotypical things.
Right, yeah.
But none of the positive things.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, thanks for clarifying that. I really appreciate that. But the first time I was watching it, I kept asking myself if I was more like Chuck, if I guess when even when you do things in a sort of radical or rebellious way, that can be institutionalized. What was once radical becomes the institution. And that's the thing about the hippie movement. They were these radicals who were rebelling against a lot of the institutions that they saw around them that they thought that were empty. And by the time you hit the 80s, a lot of those hippies were now part of this new institution, and they were making tons of money and leading businesses, Steve Jobs and people like that. And so it's very easy for the rebellion to become the institution. Mm-hmm. And I have been looking at myself the last couple of times I've watched this movie going, in what ways am I more like Chuck? Am I so sort of institutionalized in the way that I think that I'm not seeing what God is trying to do around me? And does my quote-unquote church have closed doors to the very people that God wants us to reach out to? That was one of the challenges that I know I personally felt from watching the movie.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Was there something more you wanted to say about like the newness or the hippie in the kingdom of God? Or you who brought that up?
And then this is how the movie frames it. I don't know, I wasn't alive for this. I don't know anything about this. So this is what struck me from the movie. But the parallels that they made between kind of the hippie ideology and the kingdom vision, I thought were really striking. I think this is a quote from the movie, that they're searching for all the right things in all the wrong places. Mm-hmm. And so the ideas of truth and love and even just an experience of something bigger than themselves, those are all good things. Yeah. But they're trying to find it through these euphoric experiences and drugs and things. And that's just, and that's the point that Lonnie made, is they're missing it. They're so close, but they just don't know. They're going the wrong direction. I thought that was really good because, to be honest, I'm not an experiential guy.
I'm with you.
I'm very logical and work it through. But I know there's a place for it, and I understand that. And so I think there's a balance between both. That's faith. I think should incorporate both. But I definitely see that we live in a society where people are desperate for an experience and the next experience. But they're just looking at it in the wrong places. It may not be drugs, but there's plenty of other things that they're going after. And so that just really struck me as, again, I don't know much about hippies. I wasn't around. I just know the stereotypes. And that's why I think the movie and why the revival was so, is that the fields were ripe for harvest. They were ready for it. They hungered for it. And then these people came along and just gave them it. Yeah, gave them the food, the bread of life. And so, I just thought that was really impactful.
And it's interesting seeing the people that made that impact possible. Like you had the Lonnie Frisbee, who was kind of like the radical, who looked just like them, dressed just like them, and was able to meet them where they are and bring them into contact with churches. And then you have the churchman, Chuck Smith, who's kind of got a stable congregation and has some financial resources, right? And has a starter congregation already, to work with. He went through seminary training, so that he could do the preaching and bring the word in an expositional fashion. It's it was a combination of, radical people who just didn't seem to belong at church and people in the church who had some structure and some formalized education and some experience and stability. It's when they cooperated together that this movement was able to mobilize.
Yeah.
It's like there's a cooperation of gift sets here
Yeah.
that I think every generation kind of struggles with.
Yes, for
like
sure.
you're either the organized kind or the radical kind,
Yeah.
and never the twain shall meet. Well, in the Jesus Revolution, it was a partnership between them.
Yeah.
At least in the movie, in that time
Yes.
and place. I can't say, after that. But I think at least in the Vineyard movement, I think, that started and was, there was a lot of revivals that kicked that off. But they eventually kind of stabilized, organizationalized, denominationalized, and what used to be a lively gathering became another denomination. And so, like, the structure can kind of take over, right, and kind of rob and sap some of what was cool about it away.
Right.
But, is that a necessary development? Is that an inevitable outcome of every revival? There's some of the questions that it kind of has going on in my head.
Like the whole, and this shows where I'm at, which is not the hippie, crazy radical side. The whole movie, I'm thinking, where are they getting their money from? I mean, right? It's a stupid question to ask, but in the middle, I'm like, so when all these people who are paying for the everything leave, and these hippies have no money, none of them work. Right. It seems like, and so that's the question I'm asking, because you have these practical things that come along. Like, it starts this amazing movement of like, yes, we're coming together and we're loving each other and we're caring for them, being a family for each other, but we still got to eat, right? And we still got to pay for the electricity, and so where does all that come from? And so it's that tough balance of the practical with the sort of revolutionary.
So it must be happening. Like, some of the people are making money.
Seemingly.
Yeah.
Some people are selling their fields because they're able to buy that Greg Laurie guy a car.
Right. Yeah.
Right.
But it was a very cheap car, inexpensive, barely ran.
It's a great moment when the car won't start and they're all like praying over it and everything. I'm like,
Right.
Oh my gosh, I have literally seen that kind of stuff happen before. I have experienced that. And I suspect that they were probably doing little things to make money. People who have artistic abilities maybe were selling things here and there. Like, there was probably a trickle of money coming in that was just enough to keep them sustained, as well as people probably making donations. And in the movie, Chuck, he rents the house that they're all staying in, then he buys a church building for Greg to minister in. So he's taking from his resources and using them to support, the people in need, which I'm sure, again, for him was a big thing that, he's got his family. In fact, the questions you're asking, like, that's what the dad asked Kathy, right? This dad who's not a believer, and Kathy wants to marry Greg, and he's like, so where's the money going to come from? Who's going to pay the bills? Those are good questions. Those are the very questions the dad wants answered before he lets his daughter marry somebody. They're not wrong questions to ask. But I think that sometimes we let those questions become the only questions that we ask, instead of saying these are good questions, but maybe there's some other ones we should bring in as well that might help even to answer those in a way that we didn't expect.
Yeah, and as you have, as the story goes on, I mean, Chuck Smith continues, growing organized churches.
Right.
Right. But there's something of this openness of the Jesus Revolution that's part of the DNA of them, I assume.
Right, yeah.
I don't never been a part of one of their gatherings today. And Greg Laurie ends up, starting a church or being a part of a church, and it grows to be 1,000-member plus church, right? And so obviously he's making money at some point as these churches are growing. But the prophet type, the Lonnie type, goes off to Florida. His marriage falls apart, and things kind of go dark for him in certain ways. And he has other bright moments, in the after story. But it's so the movement that grows, the institutions that follow from it end up at some point getting organized, right? And thinking about financially viable strategies. But not everyone can be a part of that. Like, and I think even Lonnie says, like, I'm the kind of guy who gets something started, and then people, thrive on my energy and use it to get something started. And then, when they're done with me, they kick me to the curb, and then I got to move on.
Yeah.
Is that like a prophet?
Yeah.
Is that the destiny of a prophet? Of course, they bring out some of his flaws in his character, but when you compare it to Jesus, it's kind of like Chuck Smith and his wife and family are kind of like Mary, Martha, Lazarus, and Jesus, and his band of homeless people, have a place to stay because there are wealthy people who have a stream of revenue, have physical resources that are now at the disposal of the kingdom community,
Right.
And so there is, even in Jesus' time, there was always this partnership between the the roaming evangelist who's not responsible fiscally,
Right.
and the people who have enough stability but are willing to make their resources available to the kingdom as ever the kingdom needs it.
Right. Yeah, I think that's what I think the movie is. One of the benefits it brings is that it should force people to take a look at themselves and say, where do I fit into this story? You know, which of these characters do I most closely associate with? Because I think there are people who are going to see somebody like Lonnie and go, oh, yeah, man, that's totally me. And they probably are right. You know, they probably are that kind of that freewheeling, prophetic type person. And other people, and this is what I said, I think that I look at myself and I feel like Chuck. Not always in the good ways either. I said earlier that I feel like more like Chuck, wondering what things are holding me back. You know, what comforts, you know, what things am I holding on to that are keeping me from embracing whatever God is doing? I think some people are going to feel like Greg, you know, feel like the searcher who was really, really searching and, you know, eventually finds what he's looking for in God. So I think you have different characters in the movie that different people are going to gravitate to. And I think that's one of the good things about it, is that it's not just one person on one journey where everybody looks the same, but it's a lot of different journeys that all lead to the ultimate answer, and that is Jesus. You know, we get to Jesus different ways, but those who are searching for God find their way to God through Jesus.
Yeah. So maybe a final discussion point to get out there, because we got like 5 minutes left.
Right.
Where do you guys see the relevance of this movie today in terms of, like, right now we live in a time where the drug culture is on the rise, and there's a subset of believers and unbelievers, right, who are drawn to truth, openness, tolerance, non-traditional lifestyles. I mean, are we living in a time similar to the time that begat the Jesus Revolution in such a way that, you know, we need to consider whether we're being that Chucks, and we need to be doing something to reach out to this culture in a way that we haven't? I don't know. What do you think about where it touches our time? Because there are definite parallels.
Yeah.
But it's not quite the same.
No, it's not the same. And so we don't want to suggest that it's exactly the same. But I think you're right that the movie should challenge us to look at our own time. I would think that at least one possible parallel would be the LGBTQ plus whatever acronyms you want to add to that community. There are a lot of Christians who, if they walked into their church, they'd be like, what are you doing letting these people in? They're staining the carpet, you know. They're sinners. They need to take a bath or whatever. That they would look at that community and say they have no place in the church. And I think there are churches who are trying to reach out. And it's like what Lonnie said. He keeps saying they're searching for God in all the wrong places. Like, he's trying to get people to turn from doing drugs and sleeping around and stuff like that. He's trying to get them to turn from that lifestyle because he knows they're trying to find truth and maybe even find God in that lifestyle. So he's trying to get them to turn away from it. But he's doing it by welcoming them in and bringing them in and having these conversations with them and saying, our church is open to you. You are welcome at our church. I can see that there is a strong parallel where a church can say, look, I'm not endorsing what you're doing. I think you're making bad decisions. You're making decisions that are hurting yourself. But I love you. I want to talk to you. I want you to be a part of our church. I want you to find Jesus, and I want to be that person who can help you with that. How do we talk their language? Like, that's one of the things they brought up in the movie is, like, how do you talk their language? Speak in a way that they're going to understand. So I would think that might be one of the parallels that I think churches are probably struggling with right now.
Yeah, I think every 30 or so years, a generation steps up and is dissatisfied with the status quo.
Yeah.
So you have the hippie revolution, you have the grunge like era, like Fight the Power, and now we're back around where people are just tired of it all. We're tired of the 1%ers making more money and politicians caring only about themselves, and everyone, like the little people, we're there. People are not happy, right? Satisfaction with life is not there. So where are they turning to find satisfaction? I think that's where we have for me the most parallels. It's not always drugs, though sometimes it's drugs. It's, like I said before, like experiences and certain lifestyles, like, well, this will give me some sort of fulfillment.
Yeah.
And for me, I think those are the places where we can step in and say, well, they're going to leave you lacking. It's not what you think it is. You may feel something for a while, but like we have something that's better. And so that's what I'm thinking of, is this idea of people constantly just looking for some experience to just counteract what they see around them, which is pretty crappy from their perspective. Yeah. And I would say they're probably not wrong. And so, so whether it's sexuality or whether there's drugs or something else, I think it's kind of coming for full circle on some level. It's not the exact same, obviously, but there are definite similarities. And I don't know, I know the churches today are supposed to have more of a come as you are, but are they really? And I mean, it's, things like, love the sinner, hate the sin, and all that. Like, I just don't see it actually working. And so I think we need to rethink about what our approach is going to be.
Yeah, and there's definitely, I think, for some who watch this movie, there's a part of it that they're going to really be drawn to. Look at the church open itself out to the outcasts of society, and things. And what's different, for our time period is those who were the outcasts of society have been affirmed by society, right? Like, laws have changed when it comes to drug use, purchase, growth, consumption, right? Sales. Laws have changed when it comes to same-sex marriage and relationships and how it's portrayed in the media. And it's and so the question, how we respond to it, the Jesus Revolution didn't respond by just being affirming.
Right.
Yeah.
It just didn't. Like Lonnie, as much as he entered their world, looked like them, spoke their language, he saw practices that were incompatible with the gospel, right, and the scriptural teaching as things that people need to be delivered from.
Yeah.
And I think where the church is being pushed today is that they don't need to be delivered for them. We need to be delivered from our intolerance of those practices and need to come to affirm and embrace them.
Yeah.
Right.
Right. That's a different movement than the Jesus movement, which to me, I didn't quite get about the Jesus movement until I watched this movie. If it's an accurate portrayal, they were conservative when it comes to the Bible.
Yeah.
And our generation is rejecting the Bible, and so our generation is more toward old school liberalism. Like, liberalism at its base is taking a cultural movement and adapting the Bible and Christianity to take on the form of that cultural movement in such a way that almost like the Bible gets subsumed under the movement, and the movement gets to trump some of the things in the Bible. And the Jesus Revolution wasn't liberal in that sense.
Right.
It was not like people who came to the Jesus Revolution, they had to convert from the hippie drug culture into the Jesus movement. Right. But the culture, the dress, the language style, the simple lifestyle, the asceticism, that all was embraced. Yeah. But all of that, you could say Jesus embraced, and the gospel embraced, and Israel would have embraced. You know what I'm saying? And so I know it's it's tricky trying to fit this into today because it's just not the same. This is not a movie that's going to affirm, acid trips. They portray the deliverance of it, the fun side of it, and then they portray the dark side of it. And, the actress whose sister almost dies, at a party on a big trip, and and her life is shaken by it, and that leads her to the Jesus Revolution. And so I think in application we got to be quick. There's contextualization and meeting people where they are and letting them be them to a point, right, and so that they can hear Jesus. But there's still a call and an invitation. And baptism is a big part of the movie.
It was, yeah.
From beginning to end.
Yeah.
It kind of framed the movie at the beginning, at the end, and even in the post story. And they still baptize people in that same place near the Calvary Chapel. So, to me, it just kind of struck, it kind of raised that conversation of, it just seems like in our culture, if you want to be the way Lonnie Frisbee was in that movie, you have to be affirming of the practices and almost join in, or at least say it's okay to come to Jesus without having to change any practices.
Right.
And this movie doesn't go there.
Right.
Yeah, I agree. I liked it. I thought it was a good movie. I recommend it. If you haven't seen it yet, I know a lot of you probably have. If you haven't seen it yet, go watch it. I've seen it a couple times now, and I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, I'd recommend it. Bring your Kleenex.
Yeah.
I was on the verge of tears almost the entire movie. It never sent me over the edge, but I had to
You're
grab my eye
sniffly.
a couple of times.
You're sniffly. Couldn't tell if it was allergies or the movie, but
Nope. The first time I watched it, I was in the same place. You know, second time I was a little more prepared for it, but the first time it was hitting me emotionally as well. I totally agree.
I was fine.
Of course you were.
But I'm a robot, so it's the way it goes.
All right. Well, thank you so much for listening to this episode of the After Class podcast. After Class because
The
The
best
best
conversations
conversations happen
after class.